Hey Civic students! What I wanted to go over today in this video are the levels of the court system, both the federal and state. Remember, the local government doesn't really have its own level of court system. It's based on the state court system. So we're going to talk about how cases will start in specific courts and how they can go to higher courts and the reasons why. So let's get started with that. As we go through this particular video, I'm going to pause every once in a while and you'll have questions to answer that are embedded in the video. Now for your grade in PowerSchool, don't worry about the grade you score on the quiz that's going to be the quiz questions that are embedded in the video. You're going to get credit just for attempting to answer the questions as you're watching the video. So again, just do your very best as you're answering the questions that are embedded in the video. So let's get started with the levels of the court system. Where does a case begin? Is it civil or criminal? It doesn't really matter for this. Let's talk about these 4 jurisdiction types that we have on the screen right here. So there are 4 types of jurisdiction right here. There's original, appellate, exclusive, and concurrent jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means the authority to hear a case. So if you have original jurisdiction, then that's the authority for a court to hear a case first. In other words, it's where it originates or where it begins. For example, if it's in a state court, then it would begin in perhaps the North Carolina District Court or Superior Court if it's a felony. That also can mean exclusive jurisdiction. So if you look down here at exclusive jurisdiction, that's the authority for only one type of court to hear a case. So federal courts have exclusive jurisdiction over federal laws, and state courts have exclusive jurisdiction over state laws. Now let's talk about this funny word here. Is it appellate? No, it's actually appellate. Appellate jurisdiction is the authority for a higher court to hear a case that's appealed from a lower court. In other words, it questions were your rights violated. Appellate jurisdiction actually doesn't introduce any new evidence. They're just looking at your constitutional rights. Did you have a lawyer? How about your Miranda rights? Is it a fair and speedy trial? So the appellate jurisdiction allows the court to review cases that have already happened to determine if your rights were upheld or violated. Then last we have concurrent jurisdiction. Concur or concurrent means both, like we have concurrent powers for both federal and state. Concurrent powers, for example, in federalism, could be something like making laws, making courts, taxes. Those are all concurrent powers that we understand. So with concurrent jurisdiction, it's where the authority to hear a case could be either in federal court or state court. For example, a citizen of one state can sue the citizen of another state, and it could actually wind up in either federal or state court. So those are our 4 types of jurisdiction that we're going to be talking about as we go through the state and federal court system. So there are 2 main types of courts. There's appeals courts and trial courts right here. A trial court, let's start with that one on the bottom. That determines if you're guilty or responsible, be it civil or criminal cases. So it determines responsibility in civil cases and guilt or acquittal in criminal cases. But let's say you feel like your rights were violated. Maybe you never got a lawyer, or you were interrogated without your Miranda rights being read to you. So the appeals courts would be a higher level of court that would determine if your rights were violated. Now, if your rights are violated, then what would happen if, let's say, the North Carolina Supreme Court determined that the North Carolina District Court violated your rights? They would remand or send back the case for possible retrial, or they could just let you go, and then that would be it. Nothing else would happen. You would get out of jail. So let's get started by taking a look at the 4 appeals courts. The 2 highest appeals court, the one in North Carolina is the North Carolina Supreme Court, and of course the highest court in our nation is the U.S. Supreme Court. Which one has more authority? It's going to be the U.S. Supreme Court, right? So what happens is that there are 7 justices that are elected to 8-year terms by citizens in North Carolina, where there are 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and they serve for life, until they retire, die, or they are impeached. This is a way to check and balance the President's appointments to office, where in North Carolina it actually gives the citizens more authority and choice for their judges. Now, actually, these 2 courts operate quite similarly, except one's for state and one's for federal. They both have appellate jurisdiction, which specifically means that they are hearing cases from lower courts to determine if your rights were violated. So that's what it says here in this note, and also over here in this note. That means that there's no new evidence that's introduced. So if you find new evidence, it can't be introduced here. You're just looking at, is a citizen's rights violated in a lower court, probably in a trial court. Now, in North Carolina Supreme Court, they hear constitutional cases from lower courts. So if you're looking at North Carolina constitutional violations or specific North Carolina laws, or they also hear automatically appeals on the death penalty cases. So if you are given the death penalty in Superior Court for, say, first-degree murder, you don't go to the Court of Appeals. You go directly, which is right here, you go directly to the North Carolina Supreme Court. In the U.S. Supreme Court, they have a limited original jurisdiction. In other words, there are some times where your case can actually start in the U.S. Supreme Court. That's mainly very few types of cases, but say where ambassadors or states are parties in a case, it goes automatically to the Supreme Court and skips everybody else. So these are the two highest levels of appeals courts. Now, I want you to understand that if you make it to the North Carolina Supreme Court and you still feel like your rights are violated, you could absolutely ask for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear your case. Now, as we continue studying about the Supreme Court, we're going to learn that not every case that comes to the Supreme Court is actually heard by the Supreme Court, but we'll talk about that later. I want to move on down to the appeals courts. So for the appeals courts for North Carolina, they have 15 justices also elected by citizens for 8-year terms, where in the U.S. Court of Appeals, these justices, again, appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, they serve for life. Both of them sit in panels of 3 judges to hear cases. Have you noticed that there is a pattern of having an odd number of judges here? Why do you think that is? Hopefully you're thinking about coming to a possible tie, that there's no way that you could, or less of a way you could come to a tie if there's an odd number of judges. So that means the majority rule would fall on the side of either the plaintiff, defendant, or prosecution and defendant. Now, none of these appeals courts have juries. None of them, not the courts of appeals and not the Supreme Courts. These are issues that are decided specifically by judges. Why is that? Because there's no new evidence that's going to be introduced. You're looking at rights violated. And who are the experts in rights? Well, that's going to be your justices. These guys have had to be lawyers, and so they have to understand the law to begin with. So it's important to understand that you have the experts to decide if your rights were violated or not. So again, both of these here, the appeals courts have appellate jurisdiction. So really the Court of Appeals are here to help the cases that could possibly overwhelm the North Carolina Supreme Court. So they actually are kind of like your first line of defense to determine if your rights are violated. Here, the appellate court is also similar to the North Carolina Appeals Court to determine if the law was applied correctly. Again, if your rights were violated. So there are 4 types of appeals courts, which I find fascinating here, to make sure your rights are not violated. That's how incredibly important it is that your rights are not violated in a criminal process or even a civil process. So a copy of these notes are below the video, so you can follow along if you'd like to, but there's also a link here, and let me take a look at that right quick. So I really like this website. It's comparing federal and state courts, and so if you wanted to scroll through it, you could take a look and see how the federal and state court systems are very different, where you've got, for example, here Article 3 of the Constitution talks about judicial power, judicial review, and the Constitution of each state sets up its own courts. Where here you have, again, looking at the federal court system, 13 courts of appeals, 94 district courts, and other types of courts as well. Same thing with states. They have courts that handle specific matters, and we're going to take a look at those in just a second. And if you continue to scroll on here, only certain cases are eligible for review by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's pretty important when you look at the jurisdiction for the U.S. Supreme Court. Selection of judges are a little different most of the time. State court systems elect their judges, and some, even in North Carolina, are appointed. For the federal court system, they're appointed by the President, confirmed by Senate. All of them, be it Supreme, Appeals, or District Court. All federal court judges are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Then you've got in this website as well the types of cases that are heard, and you could take a look here, where you've got federal on the left and state on the right. So this is just a really good website to go back to and take a look to review. And by the way, tort cases being personal injury or civil cases. A tort is just a wrongdoing, like referring to negligence. So when we looked at our civil cases generally are referred to as tort cases. Okay, so now that we've got the appeals courts down, let's take a look at trial courts. And there are actually just a couple different types of trial courts. There's just one, for the U.S. system, the U.S. District Court. There's over 600 justices, but 94 district courts all over the United States. And again, these justices are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. They have original jurisdiction for federal laws. So if you violate a federal law, you're going to find yourself in U.S. District Court. So let's say you're counterfeiting money. It's going to be U.S. District Court. They do determine guilt for federal law, so they have a jury. So this is where you're going to determine guilt, as opposed to the U.S. Appeals Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, where you're not determining guilt, you're just looking to see if your rights have been violated. Now, if you find yourself in looking at the way that the U.S. courts are set up, you've got District Court, you've got the Appeals Court, and you've got the Supreme Court. So there's S, A, D. So maybe that's a way you can remember the three courts for federal courts: Supreme, Appeals, District. If you find yourself in the U.S. court system, you're going to be very sad. So let's take a look at the North Carolina court system. The North Carolina court system really has two instead of one, two main courts for trials: the Superior Court and the District Court. Superior Court is a little more severe. They're actually mainly for felony cases and civil cases that are over $25,000. So they have original jurisdiction for those cases. They have justices that are elected for 8-year terms. Now, the other thing, this gets a little weird. It has appellate jurisdiction for cases coming from District Court. Because District Courts, you'll see right here, do not have juries, okay? Now, Superior Courts automatically have a jury, and with Amendment number 6, guess what you're guaranteed? You're guaranteed a jury trial. So let's take a look at the North Carolina District Court. The North Carolina District Court has justices that are elected by citizens for 4 years, and they hear civil, criminal, juvenile, and magistrate matters, in other words, like minor infractions, for example. There are no juries in district courts, and a lot of people discuss, why is this? There's a really good reason for that. So many people in North Carolina go through district court. This is an expedient way to process these cases very quickly. So a judge will hear and interpret the case, decide the case. However, if you are found guilty, you can automatically appeal to the Superior Court because, of course, you're lacking your Amendment 6 right. The question is, do you think a lot of people would spend time and money doing that? Not a lot. So a lot of people would just take whatever it was that they their punishment and just leave it at that and not move on to Superior Court, even if they really weren't guilty. So that could be a setback to not having juries in district court. But on the positive side, it does get cases through very quickly. So if you're found not guilty, then you're done. And so with types of civil cases, so again, these are civil, these are between people. In a district court, you would find divorce, child custody, child support, cases involving less than $25,000. Now, district courts are going to handle misdemeanors, while again, if you remember, your Superior Court's going to handle felony cases. And district court's going to handle civil cases involving less than $25,000, where if it's over $25,000, you're going to find yourself in Superior Court. Now, in civil cases, we have magistrates, and magistrates right here are authorized to try small claims cases, and those are $10,000 or less in North Carolina. Landlord evictions, suits for recovery of personal property, and motor vehicle liens. And then when you look at criminal cases, the magistrate is authorized to issue warrants for arrest, to set bail, accept guilty pleas for minor misdemeanors and infractions like traffic tickets, or accept waivers of trial for certain worthless check cases. And you could go to this website, this is where I got the information, nccourts.gov, right directly to the source to find a little bit more about this information. And I have just a couple of maps that I wanted to show you really quickly in pictures. So this is the North Carolina Supreme Court Justices versus the U.S. Supreme Court Justices. You'll see the U.S. Supreme Court Justices. There are more. Why do you think that is? Hopefully you'll be able to answer because of the types of cases that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear. They're going to focus on constitutional cases, U.S. constitutional cases. The North Carolina Supreme Court is going to mainly focus on the North Carolina Constitution cases. And then looking here at the North Carolina Superior Court District. So this is what I mean by court districts. That when you look at this, that all of these different colors are going to be representative of a specific court district. You'll see here, for example, like Cabarrus County has their own right here, but there are some counties over here out to the east, and of course in the mountains that are very rural, so they're just going to have one district court for that specific amount of people. I'm sorry, one superior court for that amount of people. So I know this is a whole lot of information to take in, so that's why I'm hoping that this video will help us as you pause and have to answer some questions. But I want to review one more time and now start at the bottom and work our way up. So let's say, for example, that you committed some sort of misdemeanor infraction. And let's say in our criminal justice system, and we looked at steps to criminal cases. Let's say, for example, you've been arrested, booked, you've had your arraignment, you pled not guilty, and so you're going to have your trial. So as a result of your district court case that's a misdemeanor, you're found guilty, but perhaps you weren't read your Miranda rights, so you could appeal your case to the next highest court. And what is that? That's the North Carolina Superior Court. So let's say you go through again with another trial through North Carolina Superior Court, and they find you guilty again, but you're still saying you weren't read your Miranda rights. Where would you appeal to next? Would you appeal to the U.S. District Court? No, this does not have appellate jurisdiction. This court is only there for specifically federal laws. And so you would go from North Carolina Superior Court to the North Carolina Supreme Court, or Court of Appeals, I should say. Either one you could go to. So let's say you go to the Court of Appeals, and they evaluate your trial that you had in both District and Superior Court, and they say, hey, nope, your rights weren't violated, but you still think that they were. So could you appeal to the North Carolina Supreme Court? Absolutely. You could appeal to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Let's say they decide that your rights weren't violated, because again, they're not looking at new evidence. They just have appellate jurisdiction. Where would you go next? You could go either to the U.S. Court of Appeals, or you could go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, especially if it's dealing with your Miranda rights and a constitutional right. You could write to the Supreme Court and ask them to hear your case. And they, of course, would be able to determine in finality if indeed your rights were violated. If they say no, your rights weren't violated, then I'm sorry, the case is done. Now, if they say your rights were violated, they may remand your case back to Superior Court in North Carolina, right here. They're not going to send it back to U.S. District Court because you didn't violate a federal law, you violated a state law. And even though it was a misdemeanor, they're going to make sure you have a jury trial. So if they're going to retry you, they would put you in North Carolina Superior Court and give you yet another trial. So that, again, a lot of information here. So if you have any questions, be sure to send me an email. But we're going to be working with the levels of court and how court cases go through the court system all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we'll look at a few other Supreme Court cases as well. Okay, sorry, this is my dog Ranger. He wanted to be on video right quick, so he needs some love. So give shout-outs and love to Ranger. Ranger, say hi to everybody in Civics. Hi. Good job, Ranger. All right, let's pause. So as you're going through and you're answering some of these questions, be sure to send me emails if you have troubles or issues getting into the video or answering any of the questions. And next week we're going to review some of this, so don't feel like this is all that we have to try to understand this information.